back to another episode of the Backroads Build podcast. Today we're going to be talking about a story that is very close to a lot of people here in the North Bay and area, as it was really a big part of our history earlier on in the 1930s and 1940s, and that is the Dionne Quintuplets. We are going to be joined by the curator of the Callander Bay Heritage Museum and Alex Dufresne Gallery, as she's going to be telling us the story, the good, the bad, and all the details about the Dionne Quintuplets. Well, today we are pleased to be joined by Natasha Wiatr, and I won the guessing on how to pronounce your last name. You said it's Polish, right?
It is, yes.
It is, yeah. Yeah. So you are the curator of the Callander Bay Heritage Museum and Alex Dufresne Gallery. Dufresne. I said it perfectly the whole time until I'm on camera. So the Alex Dufresne Gallery. You've agreed to come on and talk about a topic that's very ingrained in North Bay. It's very ingrained in like the North Bay area heritage, and that's the Dionne Quints. Dr. Alan Defoe was the man who delivered the Quints. And I'm very excited to have you on. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
I can't complain. So let's start quickly with a quick history for those who don't know who the Quints are. I'll start with you, Bill, if you want to give a quick synopsis to the listeners.
I'm so glad that we have Natasha here today, because we're gonna mine some more gems. We used that line last week with Roy Slack from Cementation, but we're gonna find out a lot more about probably the most significant event, one of the most significant events in Ontario's colonial history, and certainly for what was called New Ontario, but Northern Ontario, the birth of the Dionne Quintuplets of May 28th, 1934. It really, from my perspective and stories I've done, that it was probably the most significant economic impact for Northern Ontario. Helped pave Highway 11. It helped open the north to tourism. It did so many things for the region, not just in the Callander-Corbeil area, but North Bay, put North Bay on the map. And so it was the miracle birth. And I won't say much more. I'm going to have Natasha fill in blanks, because I know today we're going to learn, and the listeners and the viewers are going to learn a lot about some things maybe we've forgotten or didn't know. And that's why we have museums and we have collections and things like that. Because again, this coming May, it'll be 90 years. The surviving Quints will be 90 years of age. And when you think about it, it's still front and center, and we'll talk about a couple of more recent books about it, because no one really forgets about some of these historic events that are so significant, such as we just talked about.
So, Natasha, what is the Callander Bay Museum, and what does it have to do with the Quints?
Well, our home is located in the house of Dr. Defoe, who you already mentioned. The one thing I will jump on, though, is you introduced him by saying that he delivered the Quints, which isn't right, but isn't wrong either. It's
interesting.
With the story, the story goes that the two midwives, Madame Legros and Madame Labelle, were actually there that night, and they delivered the first three, and then the doctor arrived and took over the birth. But being a male in that time, being the doctor, he's the one that got all the credit, and that is something that still kind of continues a bit to this day.
You know what's interesting about that is the fact that, so I Googled that, right? So I'm like, so I Googled like, who exactly is that man? And that's the answer I got. So the fact that kind of ties into what you said, where he gets all the credit, and how that's part of the museums. Like, how are you supposed to know if the information you're presented to you is wrong? And I'm assuming that happens a lot.
Oh, it does. Yeah, we have a lot of people who come in who, for however they heard about the story, whether through their own research or perhaps their grandparents or somebody, those stories are passed on from what the people understood back then. And they can only go by what they knew, So in terms of however the media portrayed the story back then, that's how people knew. And so that's what we kind of tried to, I don't want to say correct isn't the right word, but just kind of give more insight to, and to give more information to, so that people can make more informed decisions on what they feel, different aspects of the story, kind of how it went and what really happened.
So there's the building at the waterfront, which used to be on Seymour for a very, very, very long time. There was a lot of contention about if it was going to move down south, and then eventually it found its home at the waterfront. Now, obviously, that's their actual home, But in terms of if you go to that location, because it is a museum as well, how does that differ from what you have in Callander?
I think one of the biggest things is you're seeing the house that they were born in, but you're inside of it, and you're just seeing how small it is. And then when you know the story and you hear there's about 10 to 14 people daily that were running in and out of that house. You have the doctor, you have the nurses, you have family members who are constantly bringing firewood in to keep the stove going so that they could keep the water boiling, so that they could keep the diapers clean and keep the milk going. The reporters coming in and out, the children and different people like that. And then you're standing in this home and you're like, it's small. Like, how did all these people manage to fit in here? And they're running in and out, and just the chaos of it. It really gives perspective as to what it might have been like. And then, of course, in addition, they just have different artifacts than we do. They have one of the incubators. They have more of the clothing, and the original stove and the bed, and different things like that. There's even, if you were to go into the one room, there's a little hole that's cut out in the wall, and that was cut out by one of the family members so that when Elzir was bedridden, the mother, she could peer into the nursery room next door and actually look at her daughters from her room because she wasn't able to leave.
Yeah, and one of the things, Bill brought a couple of books that were written, and the one title where it says "The Miracle and Tragedy of the Dionne Quints," I think is a kind of a perfect title for really what the Quints are about. Because Bill, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about this book. You brought two of them. Let's start with this one, but it kind of, if anything, it embodies this story where it was a big deal at the time, right? But at the end of the day, they didn't have an easy life in any way.
Yeah, I'll let Natasha talk a bit more about the book, because Sarah Miller did come for the book signing and the launch, and I think in my introductory remarks, you've got to remember the context too. It was the Great Depression, the dirty 30s, and then eventually the whole story, as Pierre Burton points out, church versus state, English versus French, Catholics versus Protestants. I mean, these overriding themes. When the Quints, in essence, were taken by the government. But this was, I think, unless there's another one since then, this is the most recent kind of overview of this. And maybe, Natasha, tell us a little bit about this and before we talk about the Quintland sisters.
Yeah, so The Miracle and Tragedy, that was released in 2019. Prior to that, I believe it was 4 years that Sarah had actually come up from Michigan to do research in the North Bay area and Callander area. So I did get to know her quite well, and we assisted with a lot of her research. She would just kind of show up, and I'd kind of hand her a tote of items and archival material and kind of go, have fun. And so she really had a chance to dive into our collection and found a lot of really neat little gems and different things, some things that I didn't know about. And so it was really nice to be able to work with her. And then, of course, she was able to share a lot of her research with us, which was huge for us. She's still somebody who, if I find something new or interesting, I'll send her a message and be like, hey, did you know this? And get some insight from her. She did a fantastic job with that book. It really is one of the most unbiased, neutral views of the story. And she's just done a wonderful job. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, again, there's been several books in Pierre Burton's kind of epic book back in the day, but this is kind of, it's a good way to look back from fresh eyes, we'll say, looking back at the past. Whereas this one here is Quintland Sisters by Shelley Wood. This is a work of fiction, and it's a storyline using the Quints. But I'll just have Natasha maybe make a couple of comments about this, because it's not the same as research as opposed to writing a story.
Yeah, it is. It's a little different. For one, it's written from the point of view of a nurse, a fictional nurse, one that did not exist. There are real characters in it, like Yvonne LaRue is a big character in it, and of course the doctor and the family. Sorry about that. And so it's written from the point of view of this nurse, which is an interesting perspective in itself. So it does have the book certainly has value in that we don't consider what life would have been like for the nurses back then. Because they lived a very secluded and isolated life, and they were known as the nurses of the Dionne Quintuplets. So these young women, when they went into public, they were hounded by the public because people knew who they were. And so, especially during that time, young women, you're looking to get married and different things like that. And that would have been very difficult for them to do. And so none of those nurses lasted more than a year except for Yvonne LaRue. So, sorry about this. So it's an interesting insight into what life may have been like for them, because it's just something that we don't really consider what life could have been like. On the other hand, the book is fiction, and so there are certainly some outright facts that are not correct, and there's a bit of a portrayal of the Dionne parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dionne, that isn't always the most flattering, and I don't believe that's fair to them. And just some things that happen in the book that just certainly did not happen in real life. And it just doesn't really seem fair to a family who's already gone through so much for so long to still have to deal with inaccuracies and half-truths and outright lies that do not put the family in a very nice light.
And I think it's good because as a curator, you know the facts, and of course this is a really important story, as we pointed out. And of course this is important for Backroads Bill because most of Backroads Bill does its sense of place. And I know in the past when we've done a story, and again I drive by the original where the original homestead. In fact, my father built a house exactly for Danny Dionne, and it's a lot of things. Mrs. Dionne had children after the Quints. She had children before.
She had 14, right?
I think yeah.
Yes.
And so that's interesting in itself. But the site, and then of course what was created by the government in essence on Highway 94 between Callander and Highway 17, Corbeil. That's, I'm always, when I drive by, I always think of the Quints because Nipissing Manor is in its place. But now, and I wanted to, one of the reasons to have Natasha here is just talk about what's left of the playground, the viewing area. And that caught my interest. I think it was a summer pass, and the remaining structure was torn down, and you really only have an ornamental fence and the two pillars where at some, I guess in its height, up to 6,000 people would come each day to look at the Quints. But let's just talk about what remains and talk about Nipissing Manor and just what you see today as compared to what was back in 1934.
Today when you drive by, it's a very unassuming place. You wouldn't have, if you didn't know, you wouldn't expect that 3 million people would have walked those grounds. I believe it was 2021, COVID years, they kind of mess with our sense of time a little bit. I believe it was 2021, though, that yes, the nursery was torn down in the remaining structure of the observatory. So that nursery would have been the hospital that was built that the girls grew up in for the first 8-9 years of their life. And in addition, there was a little almost shed. It was pink in color, but what that was actually the north exit of the observatory, of the outdoor playground. And so that had also stood for a long time. And from our understanding, that had been turned into a little chapel for the family. But it was torn down as well with the nursery. As for what else remains out there, you do actually have the staff house still sits, and that's when you go out there, it's the white house that sits in front of Nipissing Manor. That's the original staff house building. Nipissing Manor itself, the left part of it, you'll notice kind of looks like a bit of a mansion in a sense, and that was the big house that was built for the family, not paid for by the government as what was assumed by a lot of people, but paid for by the quintuplets themselves out of their trust fund. And then if you were to look to the far right, there's just a blue house, a residential private dwelling today. And that was the original building of what we kind of call the Clock Tower Pavilion. And that's that souvenir shop that has the clock tower on top that would show the next time that the Quints would be shown. As well, we have the original fencing, which lines the area. It's green in color today, but it was barbed wire at the time, as well as the original pillars that were the gateway to go into like up the driveway up into the nursery. Those two pillars still remain. So if you know what you're looking for, there is still some stuff out there.
Yeah. The people you can only imagine, would rush across. I've seen photos of it. They would rush across the street, and I guess there would be some organization after that. But of course, you'd like to be the first ones in, and there were certain viewing times. It was a spectacle, I suppose. And again, when you drive by. And of course, I've always thought there should be a roadside plaque there. I've thought it, I don't know, all my adult life. They're everywhere, but not there. Again, one of the most significant events in Northern Ontario, and there's no roadside plaque.
You know what's really interesting is when we think about the Quints, they were kind of like just paraded around and like put on this against their will, really. So I want to start with this question first, just for context. How did this all begin? Like, whose decision was it to have people come and want to see them and kind of live, because they lived a really tough life, and whose decision was that for them to be put in that position?
It was something that just kind of snowballed. I mean, when you have the very first days of the birth, you have the notice that goes in the newspaper. You have the brother of Mr. Dionne, the uncle of the quintuplets, Leon Dionne, who phones the Nugget and asks the editor, will the birth announcement for 5 babies cost the same as for 1? And that's what really gets the ball rolling. And of course, they think it's a joke, but they realize that it's not. And it goes out, just this tiny little blurb goes out in the Associated Press, and it hits the world. And suddenly you have the Toronto Star that's showing up. You have a reporter from Chicago, Charlie Blake. He actually shows up with the very first incubator. And that incubator 100% saved Marie Dionne's life, as well as the others for sure. And that incubator was kind of special because the home didn't run on electricity at the time. It was really hard to find an incubator that didn't run on electricity, even at that time. And so they managed to find this incubator that was buried in the back of some supply attic or something like that. And then he lugs it across the border. He gets stopped by customs and gets halted there for a little bit, and then they make him pay like $1.37 or something like that to get across the border with this big hunking piece of metal. That's
probably a lot of money back then too.
Honestly, yeah. And I guess it was the Canadian customs officers didn't understand, and they didn't know what it was, and he was like, and literally as the minutes are ticking, Marie Dionne's life is in jeopardy, and so when you look at the newspapers, they really did help with a lot of the supplies and stuff in the beginning. The Toronto Star actually custom built a number of incubators for each of the different girls. They brought supplies, they brought their own nurse along. And so the doctor, he kind of felt that the more publicity there was for the story, the more help that they would continue to get. The more people cared publicly, the less likely anybody was going to let those babies die without enough supplies and different things. And then when you turn that around, he also felt that because of the public interest saving the girls' lives almost, the public deserved to see them. Mm. And so in the early days, people would come and they would just come and kind of peering through the windows. And then eventually grandfather Dionne would kind of hold them back with a pitchfork and kind of protect the property. Yeah. And once the girls went across the road into the nursery, the nurses would actually hold the girls up on the porch to the crowds. So the people were coming. So it wasn't so much advertised as come and see the quintuplets. It was a curiosity, and people were just coming on their own without any prompting. So the people were coming. So how do you deal with that? Okay, well, let's appease them a little bit by at least showing them the girls. And then by 1936, like thousands of people are coming a day. And so this idea came from Dr. William Blatz, a child psychologist, to build this horseshoe-shaped outdoor playground that would at least corral the crowds. Like, it's quite messed up when we think about it today, that it's literally a zoo exhibition, walking in through a turnstile that counts the number of people, which we actually have one of the turnstiles on our front lawn, and I believe the Quint Museum has the other turnstile. Mm-hmm. And then you walk in, and some of you go to the left, some of you go to the right, and then you're looking through these one-way kind of windows and watching these girls play, who apparently couldn't see them, but the girls later said that they knew people were there. They could see the silhouettes and they could hear the people laughing and talking and stuff. But then you go through and just you see this amazing sight, I guess, at the time that would just blow people's minds and would just create this sense of wonder. They would finish and then they would get right back in line again. They would go through 3 or 4 times before the showing was over. So it just escalated. You had people coming at the start. They just kept coming. They kept coming. And so it was probably wasn't really a decision made to put them on display. They were just on display from the very first moment they were born. And so just how do you control that? And
what was the financial gain that the family made from this?
The family did receive a monthly wages, or almost like a salary sort of thing, from the trust fund.
So just before we go there,
yeah.
What is the trust fund?
The trust fund was essentially a bank account that was opened, that was managed by the Board of Guardians. So to kind of go back a little bit further, just how we got here, if you wouldn't mind.
No, 100%. Because I don't know what it is. So I'm curious. And I'm sure a lot of people listening are.
Well, it's just because a lot of the times when you read the story online, you read the government stole those babies away months after they were born. Mm-hmm. That's the story summed up, right? That's not quite what happened, though, and it's not in any attempt to defend or vindicate the government, because the government certainly did do that. They just didn't do that until March 1935. In the beginning, a few days after the girls were born, the father, Mr. Dionne, was approached by the Chicago World Fair, and the Chicago World Fair basically said, "Hey, if you allow us to put your babies on display for a period of time, a 6 to 8 week period, we will pay you handsomely. We will give them the absolute best medical care that they can be given. And, everybody will benefit from this. They'll be looked after, you'll be financially sound, and it'll only be for a short period of time, and then you can go back to living your life." And now at this time, you have to remember that for Mr. Dionne, everything is uncertain. His wife almost died in the childbirth. He has 5 other living kids to look after. And now he has these 5 tiny babies who are on the verge of death. They're reliant on this breast milk that's being shipped in from out of town. They don't even know if that's going to keep on coming. They don't know if they're going to get help or not. And so it was a solution, and he talked to his priest about it, and his priest offered to be his business manager, and the priest would get a cut of the deal, 7%, I believe it was. Mr. Dionne would get 21%. And he talked to the doctor in his very typical, blunt, to the point way, basically said, "They're not going to live. You have 5 other kids. You might as well make money while you can." And that's a very callous and blunt way of saying it, but the doctor did attend the birth of quadruplets earlier in his career, and none of them lived more than a week. So blunt, realistic, not optimistic. Yeah, basically. And so he signs this deal. And then the news gets out, and the news isn't so much villainizing Mr. Dionne for signing this contract. It's more, the Americans are going to try to steal our babies, and we can't allow that to happen. And he gets hounded by more and more promoters who are trying to offer better deals, and he just wants to wash his hands of the whole thing. He's like, you know what, I'm out of this. My wife didn't sign the contract. It's not valid. I'm out. And Chicago says, "No, you're still locked in, or we'll sue you for breaching contract." So basically what they do is, this is when the government kind of starts to step in, and they get the Red Cross to come. And the Red Cross basically offers, "We will look after your girls for 2 years. This will ensure that you will have enough time to deal with anything in the courts, if anything goes to court. Plus 2 years, we'll make sure that they're nice and healthy, and that they're out of their desperation time and very weak time when their immune systems are so compromised. And we'll build a hospital across the road. We'll staff and pay the nurses. We'll make sure the breast milk keeps coming. We'll look after everything for 2 years." It's an ironclad solution. I mean, the parents didn't like it because for them it was giving up their God-given rights as parents, but they knew it was the best solution for the girls at the time. And so they willingly signed custody over. Now, it did come out later from the parents that allegedly Dr. Defoe threatened to resign if they did not sign this contract, and that by the doctor resigning, that meant that the breast milk would stop coming, basically signing a death warrant for the girls. We don't know if this was true or not, that it came out years later. It's possible it could have been, it's possible it's not, but it's certainly just another one of those things where we don't know what the truth is, but it's important to mention because it gives more insight into the situation. Because if that's the case, then it really does sound like that the Dionnes had their hands tied, and they really did have no choice but to sign that contract. But it was done so everybody at that time was just working together to try to keep the girls safe, especially from promoters and different things. Unfortunately, as we already talked about, as their fame grew and people started to come, that's when greed started to get out of control. But with this contract came a board of guardians. And on this board of guardians were a number of individuals, including the doctor. The father was not on this board of guardians, but the grandfather was. And this board of guardians was entrusted with looking after this trust fund. So this is I don't know how I do this, but
yeah, you're good. I'll also take pictures afterwards too, in case people can't see
this is probably a better one because the girls are a little bit younger, but things like these ads started to show up, and they signed deals with film companies, toys and dolls and all this sort of stuff started to come up. So all these things were signed so that the girls would then get this money later in life. And so this trust fund was built for that purpose. The trust fund was also used, though, to pay for a lot of expenses. So by about 1938, 1939, the amount of money coming into the trust fund was equaling the amount of money almost coming out, with how many people were dipping into that trust fund. So although thousands and thousands of dollars were going in, money was also coming out.
It sounds like there's a conspiracy behind that. I don't know, Bill, if you want to add anything there.
Well, there's a lot of strong personalities at the time, and things are moving. It's often in risk management, we call it the anatomy of a mistake. Not that it was a mistake was being made; it was for the goodness of the children. But nonetheless, everybody was getting, their fingers in the pie, so to speak. I just finished a story with Terry O'Reilly, The Age of Persuasion, because he talks about cemetery tourism. But I wonder if he's done a piece on this, because what you just showed us it's all marketing. Right, they use the Quints as, so I will follow up with that, because I think that's intriguing. He would have a field day with that, because all the products, and the one right there is Colgate and dental cream, and on it goes. Pablum, I think, the rest, diapers and all kinds of things. So yeah, no, it's such an intriguing story. Again, it'll be 90 years have gone by, but nonetheless, it's when you dive into it, it's almost unimaginable. What went on at the time, and how they created the zoo, so to speak, on Highway 94, and what transpired, and as they grew up, and their attention to the Quints lasted for a long time. That was another thing. Again, it was in the dirty 30s and then onward, but they never. There's always been intrigue.
Yeah, my favorite perspective thing, I guess you could say, is when the girls, when they were adults, did an interview with the National Enquirer. Now, the National Enquirer, of course, is a magazine that's interesting. Some of their stories may appear to be quite outlandish and a little bit out there. And then you have this story that's like, we were on display in a zoo. We were taken from our family and held captive, essentially. Our hands and feet were tied to the bed at night. 3 million people came and looked at us through a window. And if you didn't know the story and you just saw that headline on that paper, you would probably dismiss it as being outlandish and out there, just like any other article in that newspaper. But everything is real.
Wait, they were tied to their bed?
Yes. In an attempt to thwart unsavory explorations of their bodies, you could say. Because it was dirty.
At what point, what age were the Quints kind of, I guess, released from this living situation? Well,
what ends up happening is, so when this first guardianship is signed and everything continues on for the first year, in February 1935, the parents, who at this point, keeping in mind, everybody's making money. Like the midwives have already opened up one souvenir shop and they're making money. Obviously, these advertisements are happening. People are coming. Well, the parents, they know that when they get their kids back in 2 years, they need to expand their home, make it a little bit bigger, buy medical supplies, and show that they can look after their kids. So they need some money too. And you can't condemn them for that, because everybody was making money off them, off of their own daughters. And so they go to Chicago on this Parents of the World Famous Babies tour, where they literally stand on stage for like 5 minutes and they just say, "Thank you for your interest in our babies." And like, that's like it. They don't do a show. They don't do anything. That's all that they do, but the crowd goes wild and claps and cheers for them and all this sort of stuff. Now, they do this, and the premier at the time, Mitchell Hepburn, he sees this as a political opportunity. He sees that he can become the savior of the girls by protecting those girls from those parents that just keep on exploiting them, because, they already got them out of one deal that the parents had already signed. Now they're on display in Chicago making, in his words, not ours, like making fools of themselves on stage. What are they gonna do when they get their girls back? They're just gonna exploit them again. So we can't have that happen, which is complete and utter false. Like, that's obviously not what would have happened. But that's politics for you. And so he played that up, that he could be the savior of these girls. And so he forces an act through government called the Dionne Quintuplets Act of 1935, and that happens in March. And that effectively makes them wards of the crown and extends the guardianship to the age of 18.
Wow.
So when you read the stories online, the government stole those babies. They did, but not until March. And it's kind of disingenuous to all those people that worked all those months prior to just work together to keep those girls alive with the best of intentions. It just, as money came in and as the popularity and fame came in, that seems to warp people, as we've certainly seen throughout history. And so that situation then stayed until they were about 8 years old, is when the family regained custody. They returned home when they were 9. And in 1942, the building of the big house commenced. And when that was done, the entire family moved in. And from then on, the family lived as a whole until the girls were, I believe, when they turned 18, they left home.
You know what's really interesting is that we look back at this and we go, that is great. Like, that's terrible, right? It's a terrible thing, which it is. Like, there's greed, there's all this stuff. But it's happening today. People get exploited. People are exploiting their children and their lives on social media. We see that with a lot of like YouTube channels or social TikToks or whatever. It's kind of interesting when you look at that angle and you're like, it's happening again, but we won't realize it until way later when these people grow up and they go, wow, like that literally happened. Obviously it's a different scale, but what do you think? And I know like you look at like Octomom, right? Well, that was probably like the latest thing where she had like 8 kids and it's a big deal. But what do you think drove people so crazy about this event?
It was a good news story. In the mid 1930s, nothing good was happening. I mean, when you look at the town of Callander specifically, 4 out of the 5 sawmills had shut down. 700 of 900 people were out of jobs. Their own welfare officer couldn't be paid. So that just goes to show like what situation that they were in. And then you have rumblings of war going on over in Europe. And it's just an awful time. There's just nothing good happening. There's no good news. And then you hear of the story of these 5 impossibly tiny little girls managing to survive, a birth that they shouldn't have survived probably in the first place, with meager medical care, no electricity, no running water, none of that kind of stuff. So not even in a hospital or anything, in the middle of the woods, quote unquote, of Northern Ontario, or just Canada at the time for everybody else. And they just instilled this hope in people. There was this sense that if these girls can pull through, maybe we can pull through. I mean, there were even young families at the time who were influenced into actually having kids because they didn't want to have kids and bring them into this world, this depression world. But then when they saw these cute little girls, they kind of, it changed their minds, and then they started deciding to have families again. And it was just good news. And so people religiously followed them in the newspaper. I mean, newspapers are notorious for not always having the most positive news, right? And so you're reading the newspaper and you're reading all this terrible stuff that's going on, but then you see the picture of the cute little girls, or you see their weight chart and you see, oh good, Marie gained an ounce of weight this week, that kind of a thing. And it just captivated people. Yeah,
the medium is the message. And of course there was radio and newspapers, and that's about it. So you'd follow intently. One question: when did the viewing and that whole viewing platform, when did that end? How old were they then?
Pretty much 1942 when they returned home.
Okay.
There are some accounts that at times their siblings would come out on display with them and just kind of play with them in the playground in that 1941, 1942 kind of time when the family regained custody. But it really petered off. And not only, I think, because, well, you have the family getting the girls back. You have the fact that the girls are like 8, 9 years old now, and they're just not those bumbling little toddlers that are like, wandering around anymore and looking all adorable. Like they're young ladies, and the war's going on. 1941, 42, it's in the middle of the war, so people just don't have the money to travel up anymore, and so interest just started to wane.
Yeah, very interesting. So you obviously being the curator of a museum that focuses on the Quints, what is your mindset when it comes to the stuff that you curate and you collect? Is it kind of trying to tell the true story, I guess, of what happened, or do you have like I wouldn't say an agenda, but like a goal, I should say?
Well, it's hard to say the true story of what happened, because even still today, there's so many things we still just don't know truly what did happen. We only have the accounts of the media at the time, and we only have the accounts of the girls themselves from what they remember, and you have the accounts of the family and the family members who have had, like the family members today who would have heard the story from their parents or their grandparents and kind of passed down secondhand. So in terms of the truth of the story, we can only go by with the information that we have. And so for us, it's providing as much information as possible from both sides, you could say, and kind of going, here's what we know. We know this happened, but we also know that this could have happened. And if this could have happened, then that changes what this happened. And so by presenting all the facts as much as we know them, kind of giving the option to the visitor to kind of make up their own mind on kind of what they feel, who was in the right, who was in the wrong, was anybody in the right, was anybody in the wrong, because history is never black and white. It's never that simple. For a big core of it, though, is really just recognizing that the Dionne quintuplets were the victims of this story. Everybody, various people suffered and such, but at the very core, it was those little girls that were exploited, taken advantage of. Everybody else made money off of them. Like I said, the midwives, the doctor, the parents ran 2 souvenir shops.
Yeah, and it shows that it starts off, as you said, it starts off with the right intentions in mind, right? To keep them alive. And then from there, and then they need money to kind of, again, it's all about survival. And then it turns into greed, and eventually it just snowballs into what happened. What did the Quints afterwards? I know they were very vocal afterwards, but was there anything that really comes to mind in terms of the psychological impact it had on them to how they acted in adulthood?
One example you can certainly go with was money, and how they really weren't told or taught what money was, how it works, what it means, what it's worth, and all that. And so you have the story of Marie, who once they received they received sections of their trust fund throughout the years. Like as they would turn 21, they received 30% of their trust fund. They turned 30, they received another 25% of their trust fund, sort of a thing. And that situation was set by their parents. And Marie opened up a flower shop in honor of one of the sisters, Emily, who had passed away when she was only 20. Emily and Marie were closest to one another so Marie was closest to Emily out of any of them. And so I know that, it appears that Emily's death certainly hit her very hard. And so she opened up this flower shop in Montreal, in honor of Emily, but she did not really know how to operate it. And I mean, how could she? She never had the opportunity to be taught business by any means. So I guess the stories are that, she just gave a lot of flowers away for free, for example, like it wouldn't charge people. And very quickly that business went under. And so that's just one example that, that of something that we take for granted as knowing and understanding today that they wouldn't have had much of a grasp on. Or even when it came to dating, when they were teenagers, the Defoe Hospital, the nursery that they grew up in, was actually turned into a school for them. And so they attended essentially private schooling there. And the father handpicked girls from different families in the area to attend school with them. So they did attend school with other girls their own age. And they would kind of hound these girls and ask them questions about boys and about dating and different things like that, just like any teenage girl absolutely would. But it's something that they had really no concept of because, I mean, really, when you think about it, how much interaction would they even have had with boys of their own age growing up at all? It honestly, probably not a whole lot now that I think about that. It was all like older men, actors and doctors and psychologists and all this. And other than their own little brothers, that would be the only people of their own age that they would have interacted with.
Yeah, because they didn't go to school or anything like that, right? Did they? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. When was the apology from the Crown?
That was 1999, I want to say. It was like 98, 99 is when they started this campaign up against the government. And yeah, they demanded an inquiry into their trust fund. They demanded an apology and they demanded compensation. And they did receive all three of those things. They were each, at the time, it would have been Yvonne, Annette, and Cecile, as Marie had passed away in 1970, I believe, or 69. Just slipping my mind right now exactly, but around that time. And then Marie's estate also received, they all received $1 million. They did receive an apology from the government, and there was an inquiry into the trust fund, but nothing really came out of that. Nothing was really found to be amiss, apparently. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Natasha, for coming in and taking time out of your busy schedule. Anything that you can tell us about the museum itself, Obviously, again, you're the curator of the Callander Bay Heritage Museum and Alex Dufresne Gallery. I got it right.
There you go.
Second time. So if people want to learn more about the story, they want to learn more about like the facts, where would you say that? How do people start?
Well, you can certainly come and visit us in Callander. We're located just up the road from the main downtown square, where you find like Lulu's and the RBC Bank and the waterfront, on Lansdowne Street. Red brick house, white picket fence, actually newly replaced white picket fence, which is kind of exciting for us. And yeah, we have a beautiful museum and art gallery. More than just the quintuplets, we talk about the logging history, the shipping history, the geology, the railroad. We have a 1920s barber shop, which is really, really cool, and actually does relate to the quintuplet story in a way. So there's a lot of little hidden gems like that in our museum, where we're considered the hidden gem of downtown Callander. And we run 9 art shows a year. So we have art on all year long, and we're open Tuesday to Saturday, 10 to 5, all year long as well now.
So you can get your hair cut there? Is it a working barbershop?
We do have a mannequin that's been sitting there for about 40 years waiting for a haircut. So
if you want to learn how the barbershop's attached to the Dionne Quints, you'll have to go to the Callander Bay Museum. Yep. Well, thank you very much again for joining us today.
Thank you so much for your time.
A big thank you to both Bill and Natasha for joining me today to tell this very important story. And it goes to show you just how easily it can be to manipulate history, keep certain facts out of a story, etc. So it's very important to get these facts kind of out there. And it's great to be able to have somebody who has done so much research and so much fact checking and has really been able to uncover a lot of the truth. Well, if you're looking for more Backroads, Bill, you can always find us on your favorite podcast player, or you can find the video version on our YouTube channel as well as on NorthBayEcho.ca, where you can find a lot of other North Bay and area-centric podcasts like To North Bay with Love. If you're looking for a nice little slice of life podcast in this great city of ours, and there's also Small Town Times, which dives into more of the community issues and the political views, and that's hosted by our very own Dave Dale, who's the content director here at the Echo Podcast Network, and he also has a newsletter, Echo Essentials, which is published every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and it's a great way to stay connected to the pulse of this city, and you can subscribe to it right on our website. Again, that's NorthBayEcho.ca. And we also do have another one too called The Frontline, if you're a fan of hockey, where we cover the North Bay Battalion, the Powassan Voodoos. So if you're into the Ontario Hockey League or the NOJHL, we have all the coverage there as well. And of course, we will be back next Wednesday for more Backroads Bill Adventures.